Janet, how long have I known you for?
10 years?
It's more than that.
More than 10 years?
I'm afraid it's more than 10 years, yes. I've known Janet for an enormously long time, having been involved with family history since I was about 4, because that was obviously only 20 years ago. This was fine. Janet and I have worked together in many capacities. Janet supported my one-name study interesting gathering, which was very entertaining. I've never seen a lounge in the back of a white van until I went down to Holsworthy. But that's what the Sylophants do in Holsworthy. Anyway, we'll move swiftly on. Very strange bunch. Not related to me. Anyway, Janet Few, I'm sure many of you know her name, even though you may not have met her yet. It gives you a whole load of blurb in here, which I've seen on quite a few occasions actually, but I think the things we need to actually highlight for Janet today are, she has brought her One Place Studies book with her, which are for sale today if you wish to buy a copy. She might even scribble in the front of it, if you're lucky. And she's already bought the Family Historians Enquire Within. She is a highly acclaimed lecturer. In fact, I nominated her and she beat me in the bloody Rockstars Genealogical Award. Why the hell did I put her name forward? No joke. Well deserved, absolutely well deserved. She is #1 in the whole Commonwealth. Not just England.
Which includes America. No, it doesn't.
No, it doesn't in this case include America. But she is #1 rockstar genealogist for the whole of the Commonwealth. So I don't think she needs much more introduction, because you should all know who she is and all have voted for her, really. So I'll say no more and hand over to Janet Few, your new chair.
Yes, well, from that build-up, it can only go down, can't it? What I'm going to try and do for the last session today is really give you some ideas of what I've done in one of my one places in connection with the First World War. So, it's Buckland Brewer in Devon. There it is. I apologise for it being another Devon study, but that's where I live. I can't help that. Devon's the bit, the sort of sticky out bit at the bottom left-hand corner that hangs on to Cornwall. And there's Buckland Brewer in the north of the county. It's rural. It's highly dependent on agriculture. It was a reasonably self-sufficient community at the time of the First World War. There was the carpenter and the blacksmith and the grocer and the butcher and so on, but predominantly the employment was agriculture, which does of course mean that there were numerous tribunals, as has been mentioned earlier, for people trying to get out of being conscripted into the First World War because they were theoretically needed on the farm. Now sadly, as far as we are aware, the actual tribunal records haven't survived. However, somebody has done a significant study in the local newspaper and is of the opinion that most of the trials were reported in the local press. So that's an avenue I've not yet tried, but it's on the list. It's a very long list, but it is on the list. So this is Buckland Brewer, nice, peaceful, sleepy, rural community. Now I'm very fortunate in my one place study with Buckland Brewer in that I don't do it on my own. Most of what I have done you could do on your own, which obviously take up a lot more time than I have to spend because I've got a team. There is one main advantage of having a group behind me, and I'll come to that later, and it's to do with money. I had done a lot of work on Buckland Brewer since I moved there at the end of 2006. And then other people had expressed an interest, and we recorded the gravestones, and it was decided last year that we would create a proper society out of this. And so we have Buckland Brewer History Group. Within 3 months we became the largest society or group in the village. And I do have to say that we differ from the standard local history society in a couple of ways. One is that we actively encourage membership from people who don't, in fact, live in Buckland Brewer. Now this clearly means if you're going to take money from people who live in Canada or Australia or Berkshire, you've got to provide them with something. And that means somebody, Muggins, has to produce a newsletter 4 times a year so that they feel they're getting something, and we do research for them, and we try and include the far-flung members as much as we can. And so that's a bit of an effort, but it does mean that instead of having a membership of about 30, we've got a membership of about 50. So that has been an advantage, and because it's a PDF newsletter, they don't actually cost us anything, but please don't tell them that. So it's income that we can use for research and so on and so forth. The other thing about Buckland Borough History Group, which is a little bit different from a number of history groups, is we don't just sit there and wait for people to be interested in history and come to us. We take the history out to them. I wouldn't like to say we force it down their throats, but we do put feelers out to as many other community groups and individuals as we can and try and involve them in what we're doing, which more in a minute. Now, just to give you an idea, the population in 1911 was 645, and as Kim was talking, I thought, oh drat, I don't know how many of these are young men of possible military age, and I need to find out. But that's how many there were in 1911. We have 71 on our roll of honour as having served, and there are 9 at least others that I've discovered already that I feel have as much right on there as some of the ones that are on there. It's one of these, when do you include somebody? Do you include him because he worked there? Do you include him because his parents lived there while he was serving? Same as what's the criteria for including someone in a war memorial. So there's at least 9 others, so it gives me 80. And of those, 10 lost their lives. And in fact, the roll of honour also tells me that 6 were invalided out, which seemed to me quite a low number. So I don't know whether that's really the full picture, but that's what it says on the roll of honour. So this is the sort of numbers that we're dealing with. There's our war memorial. You probably can't see from there, but it does include full Christian names and it does include regiments. And it has, of course, got the Second World War in as well, but there are the names of the 10 who lost their lives, sort of. Because in fact, 2 of those 10, the Christian names that appear on there are not actually their first Christian names, just to make it a little bit more complicated. And here they are. Now, there is a gentleman in our village who has spent the best part of 50 years researching not just in fact the 10 men who lost their lives, but predominantly the men who lost their lives, in fact in both world wars. He is a magpie. Any bit of information you can find about these men, he's collected it. I'm being a little careful because I've been recorded. We felt we would like to get this into some kind of coherent order. You can guess where I'm going with this, can't you? And we wanted to involve the community. So we involved the local school. Now, if you're going to involve a local school, for example, expect to need to be what used to be called CRB checked, safeguarding checks, whatever. Nowadays, it would be incredibly unusual for an adult to walk into a local school in whatever capacity without being willing to go through this checking first. So expect that. Again, of course, I had the slight advantage of there wasn't just one of me, there were 3 of us who were willing to do this. And we approached the local school mistress. I should explain, it's a small village school, about 45 pupils, and we were dealing with class 2, or owls, I think they're called. So we were dealing with 7 to 11-year-olds, so we've got a wide age range of about 28, something like 28 children. And the teacher, who I know well anyway, had said that she would prefer it to be part of the curriculum. The other alternative was to run it as some kind of after-school club. We were quite happy to do that. I think, in retrospect, had we had the choice, and given the experience that we had, it might have been better as a club, but actually, would the children have been attracted to that? How do you make it sound, would you like to come to a World War I club? Would you like to come to a history club? So maybe it was better, I don't know, but it is something that you have to weigh up. Like any kind of teaching or learning activity, if you just go for everybody, you'll get the people who are more interested and the people who are less interested. And that's what we found. Some of the children were absolutely riveted, to the extent that they copied down the copyright information at the bottom of the Commonwealth War Grave. They wanted everything down there, and some of them were a little bit less interested. So on the first session, we took them down to look at the war memorial. We took them into the church to look at the gravestones, because there were gravestones relating to or commemorating some of those who died. They're not buried there, but they're on the gravestones, as we've seen earlier. That sometimes happens. And the children also planted poppies, and in fact the poppies that are in the background are the result of what they planted, and they planted them on the village green. I call it a village green. It's a very small piece of grass, about a quarter of the size of this room. And it's where the War Memorial is, and it is outside the church, just to give you the context for our War Memorial. And then we started research, and in total I think we went into the school, apart from that initial session, a further 4 afternoons, and we developed a sort of carousel affair where one group looked at the Commonwealth war graves, one group looked at the school admissions registers, one group looked at the census, and so on. Now, this was not problem-free. To begin with, the children had been divided into 5 groups, and they had been given 2 of the dead each. Bear in mind, in order to do this, we had actually done the research first. So we knew what was coming, and that was essential. It would have been no good just letting them loose on a load of names. And so to begin with, we had to give them, each group, a pair of names that complemented each other. So we didn't give one group the 2 that died in the UK, because that's boring. And we knew that there was a lot of information about one, very little information about another, so you might pair those up. You wouldn't give one group 2 that didn't have much mileage in it. So really, we had to do all this research first, so that we knew what they were going to find. The other thing we did was that we gave the teacher a list of addresses that these soldiers had come from, and she pre-planted the children in the groups who lived in those houses now. So about week 3, there's some whoop of delight as this child discovers that the soldier he's researching lived in his house. And it was done deliberately. Again, there weren't any descendants of or relatives of those who had fallen, but we did have a pair of sisters, because obviously in a vertically grouped class you do that, who shared one of the surnames. So they were given that particular soldier. So they had the 2 soldiers each, and they started to look at them. These are the things we basically concentrated on. There is a photograph in our church of all 10 soldiers. That's where those 10 disappearing photographs came from. So each group was given this is the name of your soldier, here is his photograph, now let's walk down to the War Memorial, can you see him? And then we had to do things like explain what the funny letters and numbers were after their names, and what a regiment was, and what a battalion was, and so on. And then we sent them off to look for the gravestones, and so on. We looked at soldiers died in the Great War. I used my own Find My Past account to do that. We looked at censuses, we looked at all the ones, we looked at school admissions registers, because I think 7 out of the 10 had actually gone to the school in which those children were now sitting. And that was brilliant. So we looked at gravestones, we looked at electoral rolls, which again helped them where they lived, parish registers and service records. And that was pretty much as far as we went with the children. That's all we got time for. The difficulty was, because we were doing this sort of carousel system, is that one group had to start with the Commonwealth war graves, one group had to start with the census, one group had to start with the admissions registers. So again, you had to work out which group had to start with a certain thing in order to make progress. Because because of particularly the 2 whose names were, I say wrong, but whose names on the War Memorial were not their first Christian name, you try putting that into Commonwealth war graves, nothing comes up, because obviously they're not called William, they're called John, or vice versa. So that was a little bit difficult. The other problem we had was internet access. Virtually every school has some kind of filtering system. And frequently it's not the schools, it's the counties. So it's not even straightforward with the school. So when you are going to do something like this, you have to tell the school in advance what websites you want to use. The first day we went in was the day they had just changed their internet server. Not a great success. And then we found something rather strange. People were looking at one soldier, working fine, looked for an next one, and the whole system, you have been locked out, you are not allowed to view this website. Afterwards, we realised that one of the soldiers was called James Cock. And as soon as you put him in, it all kind of went horribly wrong. So you do have to be aware of how the internet and the sites you might want to use is going to work. And the children did some wonderful work. As I say, some children were more interested than others. They made folders about the various soldiers. They wrote poems, and the poems were entered into a competition. Now, Devon Family History Society has what they call the Acorn Club. Have a look at it. Just Google Devon Family History Society Acorn Club. It's for young family historians. It's one of the kind of bees in my bonnet that we should be involving young people all the time in all kinds of history. It's a lot of what I do is to try and engage them. It's a whole other talk, but yes, you can. Believe me, you can. It just has to be done the right way. So they did these poems, and I'll show you them in just a minute, and 2 of them actually won prizes in this competition. They also had a World War I school day. Some of the children dressed up. This is them doing drill. And they had Bible texts to colour in as art. They had the old Marion Richardson handwriting to copy. And the fascinating thing about that was there's a young lady in the class who has various educational needs, including problems with attention span. Incidentally, if you're going to do this and you aren't familiar with young people, the attention span is about a millisecond on a day. Hers was worse. The day we did this school project, and the desks were in rows, and it was very, very formal, she absolutely blossomed. And I think she did more work in that day than she'd done in her whole of her school career. It was fascinating. But that's a bit of an aside. So that was all part of it. We took in toys that they would have played, and hoops and quoits and that kind of thing. It would have been around at the time of the First World War. So it was all part of the experience that the children had. We dressed up. Some of the parents went to town and dressed the children up as best they could as well. Just one of the poems that won one of the competitions of Beth's poem and Judah's poem. And they were given the first line, and they just went with it. So they all entered the competition for that. So we'd involved them really for half a term in this project. Certainly the staff were very pleased with how we went. We felt that somehow we weren't getting as much out of it as we could have done. Maybe our expectations weren't quite right, but the children by and large either tolerated it or actively enjoyed it. I would say between a third and a half were really hooked. And so particularly when they discovered, oh, it's someone living in my house, or someone living next door, or I know that surname. So that was one of the things that they produced. Now, what we haven't yet done, that's sort of finished, is looked at the men who served and survived. So there's another 70 soldiers to deal with, and there they are. And this roll of honour is in our church. And this is what we're now moving on to. Well, what are we going to do? We're going to ask for money. And because we're a group, you stand a far better chance of getting some kind of grant as a constituted group with a clear following and a community backing than you would as an individual. I would doubt that you would get grant funding as an individual. All you've got to do, we just Googled community grants North Devon, and we came up with all these weird, wonderful funds, most of which we hadn't been available. This Community Council of Devon, we got a grant through something called the Philip Milton Fund, which appears to fund disadvantaged communities. Suddenly everybody in Buckland Borough was incredibly disadvantaged. But you do have to kind of angle your appeal to suit the criteria. So of course there is a lot of rural isolation because we are miles from anywhere with a bus once a day and decreasing services. We've lost our post office, we lost our shop, we now have a community shop, but we tried to paint this picture of a declining sense of community and how important it was for people to have a sense of community. We promoted it as an intergenerational project because we were involving older people, that's me, and children as well. So they obviously liked what they saw and they parted with money. We went to the parish council. The parish council have now given us 2 grants, very small in terms compared to the Community Council of Devon, which I think was £245. Parish council, 50, but it's still helpful because we can use that. The plan for that is to use it to hire a hall, to have a community meeting, to maybe do some research workshops, and so on. And also there is a local trust, which is an ancient charitable trust in my area, which has money to give out to community projects, and we asked and we got. We got £200 from them. So money is out there. I'm not necessarily talking about lottery grants or anything grand like that. Most of these, it took us a couple of hours to complete the criteria, if that. You have to be fairly fluent with words and you have to say Anglic to what they're asking for, but it's not like filling in a 35-page national lottery application or anything like that for these. So have a look, see if you can get some money, but I will say that that's probably for groups rather than individuals. What are we going to do when we've researched these soldiers? Well, first of all, how are we going to research them? So far, this is very new, we've just started this. We've got the, what is now 80 names, well 10 of them have been sort of dealt with, so 70 names of those who returned. And we tried to find out what property they were associated with using absent voters lists, using electoral rolls, using the 1911 census. So for the majority, probably about 5 of them, we've got an address. We are now going to have a stand at the village Christmas fair, and we're going to invite members of the community to adopt a serviceman. Obviously the history group are interested. A number of the history group have grabbed 2 or 3 each, and we're going to go back to the school and ask any of the children if they want to come along and adopt a soldier as well. And then the idea is to run a series of workshops and pretty much do what we did with the children, but obviously on a slightly beefed up level. So they take their soldier, they run with it, we introduce them to the various websites and research techniques and sources that they might be able to use. We've already got copies, for example, of all the electoral rolls, we've got copies of the school admissions register, got copies of the parish registers, the graveyard is on our doorstep, and we're going to research these men. Then there will be a publication. Now I put it in inverted commas. It may well be a publication like Simon's, it may not. It may be a publication on disc, because that's cheaper to produce and you can post it overseas and so forth. If there is a publication of whatever sort, it will then be advertised through things like Family History Network to try and get people who don't live in the village to purchase it, not just us. And it will be a joint effort. This is the plan. Well, that's the obvious outcome. And we are trying to have some slightly less obvious outcomes as well. There is to be a wall hanging in the church. So we've liaised with the Church Council, PCC. Do you mind if we hang a wall hanging in the church? No, fine. And the idea is that there will be, we've liaised with the village craft group, and they do quilting and knitting and you name it, they do it. And the village craft group are going to help us to produce a wall hanging, and it will be like a quilt but not padded. So a series of squares, one for each serviceman, and people will embroider, they will perhaps use fabric paints to paint a panel. There will be something representing that serviceman on each panel. And then some poor fool, hopefully, will sew them together. And so that's one idea. These are all very, this is early days, and this is just our vague ideas at the moment of where we might go with this. But you'll see the whole idea is to involve more and more community groups with it. The idea is to have some form of village trail. Now, I'm new to explain Buckland Brewer. Buckland Brewer is quite a big rural parish. It's 3.5 miles from north to south. But the village is right up in the top left-hand corner. So actually, you've got the nucleus of the village where about half the population live, right on one edge of the parish boundary. And then stretching south and east of that is about 3.5 miles of scattered farms, a couple of little clusters of houses, but a very different kind of atmosphere, locality. And often there is quite a... people who don't live in the village feel a bit excluded. And we're trying to overcome that if we can. The other nice thing about the history group is that for those of you who live in rural villages, I'm sure your experience is the same. There's us and them. There's those whose families have been there for generations, and there's the escape to the country incomers like myself, blow-ins. I haven't been there for 4 generations. And one thing that everybody has said to us about the history group is that it contains both. And it is one of the only groups in the village that does. So to the extent that we do. So that has been really good. But we're going to try and establish a trail. So when we've identified the properties associated with the soldiers, and obviously with permission of the people who live there, we're going to try and put something in the window or in the front garden by the gate so that people don't have to go crashing up to people's front doors. A number of our village properties are onto the pavement anyway, so there are no front gardens, so that's easy. And in the window will be a little bit about the soldier that lived there, together with a QR code, so you can, if you've got the app on your phone, don't ask me, I don't understand, but if you've got the app on your phone, you can go click, and then that will take you to the page about that soldier on the website, so there'll be a little bit more information. This is not going to happen tomorrow. Now, obviously, we've got to do the research, we've got to populate the website, so on and so forth. Incidentally, our website is a free website, it's not one we pay for, it's a WordPress free version. Unlike Kim's, which has absolutely wonderful masses and masses of stuff, we don't yet. And it may be that we never will. It may be that it will be more a gateway to information we hold rather than the information and the indexing itself. Who knows? So that's another idea. We then have visions of working with the little children's choir in the village, and again with the school, to create some kind of music stroke drama thing to do with the soldiers. In fact, the children have already done their play at the end of the summer term after we've done the work with them, was related to the war. But we feel this will be 4 years on, so we're thinking of this for 2018. So most of those children won't have taken part in that. And we're going, singing the songs of World War I and having some kind of performance out of it. So it's not just straightforward, here's the research, here's the written results of the research. And in each case, we're trying to bring in other people. Partly to lighten the load of the work, of course, so we don't have to research 80 names all on our own. I have to say, we haven't launched this yet, and I think we've already got about 14 soldiers have been grabbed. There's bound to be some at the end who nobody wants, which is very sad, and I guess I'll probably pick those up. But this is the idea that by involving the community, we make work easier for ourselves, but we also help to engage them with history. Not to do with World War I, but another project that we have in 1965, when the WI in our village was 40, I think, about 40 or 50 years old, 40 years old, they compiled a scrapbook. And it was a scrapbook about the life in the village. So they knew things like how many people worked in the village and how many people worked in the big town. Would you know that now? You wouldn't have a clue, would you? And they wrote about the oldest person in the village and the youngest person in the village. They stuck bits of wallpaper in to show the sort of things that people were putting on their walls in 1965. They wrote about what they ate on a daily basis. They wrote about their homes. They wrote about the village groups and institutions in 1965. Wonderful document. We have digitised it, not terribly successfully, I have to say, because it's covered in sort of sticky pages, are covered in plastic, which makes rephotographing a bit difficult. The idea in 2015 is to do a 50 years on version. And we're working with today's WI to do that. Because this is history of tomorrow. It's all very well looking at what was going on in your community in the 19th century, but the fact that they did this in 1965 now to us is brilliant. So if we do it in 2015, maybe in 2065 someone would be really glad. Again, I suspect the end product this time will be digital or on disc or something. It may not, it may. We haven't got that far yet. But that's another way of bringing the community in and saying, actually history's quite fun really, and you can do this and you can do that. And that's certainly what we experienced with the children, that we managed to engage a lot of them in history because it was personal. It was young men who had sat in the room that they were sitting in, who had gone away to war, and we looked at the ages of the men, and we said, well, your brother's this age, and they began to put it into a bit of context. We did a little bit about, apart from the school day, we did a bit about life in 1914. and no computer. Most homes in our village, no electricity. Car would be a rarity. Probably the older man and the vicar have one, and maybe the doctor, but that would be, that would probably be on a good day. So we did that as well, and brought all that in together to try and create this portrait of these men that went and didn't, in that case, didn't come back. So we will be extending that and trying to help breathe life into people and make people see that history can be relevant and fun and associated with them rather than just about kings and queens and so on. We did incidentally encourage particularly the keener children to look at the date that their soldier died and what was going on the day the soldier died. So this one died. Oh, it's Passchendaele. What can you find out about the Battle of Passchendaele? Try getting a not very literate child to type Passchendaele. They get as far as S and the first S and get lost, But we persevered and they found things, they had books that they could use and so on. So the other thing we've got is some of the grant money we've got is going to be used to buy some books about general history of the First World War and about researching First World War ancestors and that kind of thing. So that is what we're doing. Take it, leave it, go out and do likewise, but I hope you've enjoyed listening to what we're doing. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Janet? Oh, Kev's hands rocketed.
Two things, Janet.
Go on.
One, your drill day. Who led that? How did you get that?
Actually, the teacher did it. She'd got, I don't know, I think there's been a lot of resources for schools coming out because of the centenary. And she had got copies of actual drill that was, for the teacher's manual of the period. What we didn't have was the Indian clubs, which would have been great, they probably killed each other. So it was all like sort of, as you saw in the picture, stand on one leg and put your arms up like this. And what was a bit of a shame was that some of the children, inevitable, this is going to happen in any classroom, any age, some of them were really taking it seriously, and some of them weren't. And the idea that obviously children in schools now, if you've not been in a school for the last 20 years, they don't sit still, they don't keep quiet for more than half a second, and this idea that they've got to be still and quiet, they just could not get it, that this wasn't going to happen. And then they all wanted the cane. Oh, can I have the cane? Yes. And I'm thinking, okay. But, can I stand in the corner? So it wasn't even effective to try. I mean, obviously we weren't allowed to give them the cane. But we could stand them in the corner because it was, even then you've got to be careful because you're humiliating some poor little thing. And of course children today are not allowed to fail and all this kind of idea. It's another story. When I'm Prime Minister it will change. But you did have to be careful. But they thought the punishment was fun, and it's difficult, isn't it? However, it's like these, Victorian farm programmes and that sort of thing. And particularly the one, some while ago, they did one in, I think it was the Second World War, where they took a family back and you know that your loved one is not really going to war anymore, even though they played it out. So it's very difficult in a matter of hours to try and give someone the attitudes of 100 years ago. But we tried. And you had something else?
Just one more thing.
Again.
Your work with the children sounds really interesting. Have you guys considered putting together a little package that if other people wanted to do something analogous in their communities, maybe a little resource package with a lot of great ideas you talked about and the ways to engage. And I know the soldiers' names would be different and everything, but it would seem like a lot that you did could be applicable.
The principle. Yeah. Probably do that sometime.
On video.
I didn't say when.
No, but you did say yes.
I did say yes. Why do I do that?
I don't know, Simon did the same.
I'm sorry to be a bit of a Jonah, but as of this term, the junior curriculum has changed and it now stops at Henry VIII. So we have no World War I anymore in junior schools.
No. And in fact, the senior school curriculum is going to change think in 2 years' time, certainly all the GCSE syllabuses will be changing. You can still get round it because a lot of schools will still do our locality topic. So you can get it on our locality, or you can get it as a school after-school club.
Or citizenship.
Citizenship, yeah, another one. This is something that, I mean, as I say, we did it with junior school children. You could do it with senior school children. The problem with senior school children is timing. I personally think it's a good thing to do with year 12, for those of you who don't know what that is, lower 6th children, but perhaps thinking of going, or young people who are thinking of doing history at university. Because to get them to do that, you can't do it in their last year because they're all too busy, but to get them to think like that and take part in something like that's going to look great on the CV. So that's the way in. Obviously it works better if you've got some kind of contact with a teacher. If you just march up to a school off the street and bang on the door, it's not always going to work like that. But that, as you rightly say, I mean, they're doing all sorts of ridiculous things with the school history curriculum. And what's history? Who wants to learn history anymore? It's not. I think we're just lucky it's still in the curriculum, which actually makes it more important for people like ourselves to make sure that children have some kind of exposure to history. But actually, we just gave the children a sheet that, a bit like Simon had, with a few more questions, like, when was he born, who were his parents, where did he live, where did he die, where did he serve, what battalion. I think there was about 20 questions at the beginning, and we sort of said, well, see how many of those you can fill in. And that's actually what we're going to do with the adults. It's just the quality of the filling in, I think, might be a little different. And of course we will then say, either, this is your basic, you won't be able to fill all the answers in, but as many as you can, that's the basic. But if you want to run with this and go and seek out photographs of the houses and photographs of the family and so on, brilliant. But as a minimum, we're going to try together to fill these questionnaires in.
I've got one question here.
Yes.
Two things, really. One, I'll be as brief as I can. One, the children's problem is a major problem, and we were invited by the school. Very fortunately, we're a very large village, and we have 4 primary schools. We were invited by one of them, and we turned it around the other way and said, with a certain amount of preparation, what are the questions that the children would like to know about where they live? Very broad spectrum. And so then the teacher fed us back the answers. We did some prep work on it, took it back in and said, this is one of the questions you've asked. A little bit of thing. Now, what do you know about this? So that it was a kind of two-way thing. We got a huge amount of feedback. Like you, the one with educational needs sat in the front and needed sorting out. Most of them were middling to board, and there was a cohort of some who really followed it up, and I think that ratio is well known.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, though I didn't say that, we had the pre-printed list of questions, but we did start off by saying, what might you want to know? So actually, most of the things, they didn't think about what battalion was he in, because they didn't know what battalion was, but they did think about, where did he live, and how old was he, and did he come to this school, and that sort of thing. So they fed us probably about 2/3 of the questions that we then said, here's one I prepared earlier.
The second half of mine, if I may, is that we did another setup. We were invited by the parish council to talk about the village in the summer of 1914, in other words, before the war, so that you got that golden late summer bit before the war finally broke out. And what we did for that, because we're at the middle of the village, is actually quite circular, although we don't have a village green as such, is that we did some prep work, and we could walk the sort of 3/4 of a mile around the middle of the village, and we populated the buildings with each of the people who lived there, so that we knew that in central buildings there was Mr. Fox the butcher and blah, blah, blah. And we got a huge amount of information and a lot of feedback from that. For instance, that Church Street was called Over Street originally, and we could actually walk round. We're now proposing to make a booklet out of that and do an extensive thing with other walks around the village, and that fits in neatly to a community approach to things and involving things. But that one was surprisingly successful with a fair amount of prep work, but most of which could be done out of the 1911 census,
Yes.
etc.
And one of the best things we did for engaging people with history actually related not to my one place study, although it is my place, but it came out of my one name study, which, as many of you will know, I'm associated. It's not my one name study, but it's Chris's. It's the Braun family, who basically were 95% of the population of one of my one places. And we got 30 Brauns to dress up in Victorian costume and gave them the biographies of the people who lived in that village. I mean, some of the ages didn't quite tie up. You know, somebody who was 60 who was actually the son of somebody who was 50, but they were all there in Victorian times. And we walked up and down the street in Victorian dress. We hired one of the cottages and had a school under a gazebo in the front garden. And we invited the public, we invited the schools in, and we did actually get a national lottery grant for that. I mean, this is 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And that was incredibly successful for engaging people in their local heritage. Sadly, that particular village, out of 30 cottages, only 7 are lived in full time. And it has no heart, it has no community. And we just for that, we did it for 3 days over a bank holiday, and we put the community back. And that was very, very successful.
One last question, because having run early, of course, we're now running late.
All right,
Great.
I'll be very quick. It's just an observation, really, but I would be interested to hear if you've got any comment. All I've heard today from a lot of local history groups is that they seem to be aiming very low as far as funding is concerned. I represent a small village, 192 people, and we got hold of a Heritage Lottery Fund form, very daunting, yes, but we persevered, spent several weeks actually in seeking advice on what the fund actually wanted to hear, and we ended up getting a grant of £8,500.
The money is there. I mean, it is a little bit daunting. I will admit on tape one of my failures in the sense that something I was involved in for a local lottery grant. They actually employed a professional lottery grant applier to do it, who dropped out at the last minute and left me landing in it. It was doomed to fail from the start for many, many reasons, which I won't go into now, but the main thing to get lottery funding is you've got to demonstrate community support, and you've got to demonstrate that you've got a lot of people behind you, keen for this to happen and actively working towards it, and it's not something that you thought about yesterday, it's something that you've been building up to, and so on, and that's the key to success. And there is a lot of guidance about how to submit a successful lottery grant, and they're very open. There's different types of grants, they're very open about the criteria, and you don't have to fulfil all of them, but if you can show that you are fulfilling certain ones, then it's there, and go for it. And they will come up with there's a place in Dorset where they converted a disused chapel into multi-use, so it's still a chapel on a Sunday, but it's got a community archive upstairs, it's got a cafe downstairs, and they got something like £1 million, a ridiculous amount of money. But that was a lottery grant, or large. No, it wasn't a lottery grant because it was a chapel. The chapel wouldn't let them go for lottery, but it was a huge community grant.
I'm sure Janet could go on for several hours more, and we'd actually probably enjoy it. But we do need to have a brief coffee break, so please join me in thanking Janet for a very interesting talk on how to engage younger people in the community in your one place study.